And we're live. Good morning, good evening, good night, whenever you're watching this. But live, we're here this morning. Hey, Trinity's already here.
Oh
Right on.
man, right on. Absolutely.
Schumann, what's up?
Here we are once again. Man, I feel like I just saw you the other day, so
I
it's a
know, I know.
kind of a weird experience. So pretty excited.
Yeah, we did put out a little short showing that we actually do know each other for realsies.
Yeah, surprising.
So,
Yeah,
but yeah, we hung out. It was a good time. Good Thanksgiving all the way
absolutely,
around. So hopefully you all had a good one as well.
absolutely.
Um, we won't have to all swap stories, but
Yeah,
you know,
hopefully there's no fights with people among politically and whatnot. You know how that goes. A lot
oh,
of
I was
family.
I was hoping it was going to be spicy.
Yeah,
Maybe it was exciting. You know.
yeah.
Well, I'm in the studio, which is freezing at the moment, almost literally freezing. It's in the 30s. So I have my fingerless gloves. I have my hot beverage. Schumann, are you ready to go in your
I'm good. It's
conditioned?
70 degrees right here in my room. I'm feeling good. So I'm not all bundled up like you right now, looking like a mountain man. You're stuck in your cabin somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's what's happening right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're going to be continuing our deliverance story. So we are heading into well, I was going to say heading into chapter 2, but we're already firmly into chapter 2
Hmm.
in our story here. So we're looking at the whole story of deliverance, and we're still in the setup of deliverance, except instead of setting up the whole scene, instead of setting up the kind of the people and the situations, we are specifically going to be talking about the setting up of the hero,
Hmm.
essentially.
Yeah, we're at at a pivoting point.
We are at the point where if and this is what's interesting, if you're to look at the whole hero's journey sort of thing, we're not quite to that moment of the call. This is the setup for the call. You could almost call it the beginning of that call,
Hmm.
sort of that place. So
Absolutely.
yeah, that's Trinity. I'm glad that we're a part of your Sunday morning here.
Absolutely.
And we do flap our gums.
Yeah, it's what I'm
So
good at. I'm not good at many things, but I'm good at that. So
at least good at that.
yeah.
So we're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 2, and we'll probably flip into looking at the scriptures a little bit. But where we left off last time, we were sort of at the point where Moses had been introduced, right? So he himself was delivered
Hmm.
from being mercilessly killed, mercilessly murdered is a little too on the nose with the alliteration, but he was saved by being put in a basket, sent through, and we talked about the significance of those different things, and then he was drawn out of the river by Pharaoh's daughter. And then his mom got to be paid to raise him, which what mom doesn't want that as a profession, to just get paid to do what you would have done anyway.
Hmm. Well, it's a double blessing, right? Their
Absolutely.
child gets to live, and she still gets to raise them and gets paid. So blessings all around.
There you go. So that's where we sort of end with, and then he grew up.
Hmm.
Grew up sort of in that context in the palace. And I mention Moses' mother raising him because it is going to be important. It is going to be significant. He was drawn out of the water, which is where he got his name,
Hmm.
Moses, to be drawn out, which also has a double meaning because that's exactly what he's going to do for his people. That's how he's going to be used by God. That's going to be his heroism in the deliverance story.
Hmm. And when I was looking it up, it didn't seem like people. Some people thought it was a Hebrew name that the Egyptians used, and then some people say it was an Egyptian name that the idea where Moses came from. I'm not sure if you have any other understanding of it or.
No, not a ton. But I think what it does kind of highlight is that in some of the stories, and I think for a lot of people, depending on your age, you're either going to be impacted by the the Ten Commandments version of the story or by the Prince of Egypt version of the story, the animated story. I know a lot of people have seen that one. That one's actually it's pretty good. It's pretty fun. I've watched it with my kids. But they really lean into this idea that Moses didn't know that he was a Hebrew
No, he
for
knew.
his life.
Yeah.
And that is to build tension in a movie that is most likely not true.
That makes sense. And then,
Yeah.
oh, I want to talk about the name. You know, obviously Moses meaning being drawn out. Just a little side note. I love how names have meaning in the scriptures, right? There's always meaning behind it, and it's kind of cool just looking at ourselves, knowing that when we go to paradise one day, we will be given our new names. That you know, God has a name for us, and there's always meaning behind it. So just cool seeing that in the scripture.
Yeah, exactly. The names do have significance. They do. Well, our names mean something. I always thought it was kind of funny where someone, you meet someone and like, Matthew, what does your name mean?
Yep.
And
Wow.
like, you'd say like, oh, my name means such and such. But it's funny because in the original language, you're just named such and such. It's like, what does your name mean? It's like someone who's named Charity. What does your name mean, Charity? It means charity. It's not.
Yep.
It's not a hidden type meaning. But yeah, but the name of Moses, it does have a different Hebrew meaning slightly. It talks about being like fruitfulness or something else, which also is kind of in that same concept of drawing out of something, something useful or something helpful that way. So there are some different thoughts on that, but what the story and the reason why we don't need to go too far is the story gives you the significance. The significance of the name is that it's being drawn out. So, but yeah. So with all that, let's see. Let me get back to
get into the scriptures of it.
Let's get into it. So at the very beginning, let me go and pop this in here, and then we'll kind of talk about it for a second. In those days, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and observed their hard labor. And he saw an Egyptian attacking a Hebrew man, one of his own people. And this is why I think it's significant. So in those days, it's just a transition, right? So it's like, yeah, and then later, or in our stories, we'd say like, in years past, you may have one of those places like 35 years later, whatever it is. It doesn't say it in this passage here, but he's about 40 years old. We find that out at a different time. So he's older. He is in his, we would call it his middle age, right?
Yep.
He's around 40 years old.
Absolutely.
It says he went out to his people and observed their hard labor. So this kind of dispels that whole idea that he didn't know that he was a Hebrew. And it doesn't mention that. It's
he absolutely knew.
Yeah, I don't think there's any indication in the scripture that he didn't know that he was a Hebrew. He did grow up in the palace. He probably was, he was educated. He was, as part of a member of the court, a member of the household, because the Pharaoh's daughter did adopt him. So he probably grew up with all those benefits, but probably still knew that he was a Hebrew.
Yeah. That goes back to the idea that God prepares you for your future challenges or whatever he has in store for you. That he had Moses grow up in the palace. He obviously knew Egyptian and Hebrew, obviously being around the Pharaoh and the families and the royalty and everything. So he was the perfect one to be able then to come back to then deliver his people, because he was prepared his whole life for it.
Right.
God does that. He always prepares you for whatever he has in front of you in the future.
Exactly. And actually we learn a lot about Moses and his character from this line as well. So we know that he, his upbringing and these different things, but just because you're brought up in an educated environment doesn't mean that you grow in moral character. And I think that this is most likely, again, I wanted to go back to his mother being the one that raised him. It says that she took care of him. And if it was her role to be the sort of the wet nurse for him. That was probably up until 5-6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And so who gets to instill good moral character into a child? It's generally going to be the mother first, and then of course the father as well. But the mother is going to be probably the most impactful. So it's not explicitly stated here, but I think that some of it is assumed that he did not grow up with only an Egyptian perspective on things. And I think that this verse here, these opening verses of this section here, really highlight that.
Mm-hmm.
It says that he had grown up and he went out to his people and he observed their hard labor. So he's out there watching the oppression of his own people, and he sees an Egyptian man attacking Hebrew man, one of his own people. He mentions it twice. His own people, his people.
Well, and then could you imagine how Moses feels at that point? I mean, there has to be some type of guilt of feeling privileged that you are. You know, he obviously knew that he was a Hebrew, um, child of God, and he sees his people being in bondage, being obviously he being so angry enough to kill this Egyptian that was hurting one of his people. So you can just try to relate to his perspective and where he was coming from. And this also shows his heart, right? Moses' heart. I mean, God always chooses one that has a heart, that's set right for the most part.
Yeah, you can tell this. I mean, if he grew up in the palace and really did grow up as an Egyptian, he wouldn't really care. He would. That's not true. He may care, but he would care in an Egyptian kind of care.
Mm-hmm.
He may have changed his profile picture to a Hebrew flag, and
Yeah, just a little virtue signaling.
raised awareness. I
Yeah.
don't know. Obviously, I'm joking, but Hebrews didn't have a flag. But he went out and he saw it, and he saw the oppression. Verse 12 is interesting. He says he looked this way and that way and saw that no one was there. And then he attacked the Egyptian and concealed the body in the sand. A couple things. So it's assumed that he's looking around to make sure no one's watching him,
Mm-hmm.
so that he can. So the reason why that's important is it's like he looked and he saw that this was happening. So he looked around because he knew he was going to go kill the Egyptian.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like deep premeditation, right? And then self-preservation. But the other way to look at this in Hebrew is he looked around and basically saw that no one else cared about this. There would be no justice.
Mm-hmm.
Is the idea. There's no one else is going to take care of this. And so he has to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the other way to kind of take this sentence here. He looked around and is like, is no one going to do anything? Have you ever felt like that? Where you look at a situation, is no one else going to stand up? Is no one else going to do this thing?
Yep, absolutely. Another big key here is this kind of applies into because you see he does this act even though he was meaning well. Clearly, it was him stepping in, and kind of goes back to the verse in Judges, at the end of Judges, doing what's right in your own eyes. He was believing what he was doing something right in his own eyes, but then you see what happens. Obviously, then he gets chased out, which clearly is always God's will in the end. But he took an act of killing this Egyptian, becoming God per se, in the sense he's doing something instead of having faith in God that God's going to deliver and have answers. It always comes back to then not having faith fully in God.
Yeah, and I think what it is him looking and assessing and saying, no one is going to take care of this oppression, and so I have to act. And that act was to kill one man to save one other man.
Mm-hmm.
And is that a bad motivation? I don't necessarily think the motivation was bad, but to see the oppression and to see what was going on,
Mm-hmm.
he has the option to do a number of things. And what he wants to do is he wants to correct it himself in his own way. We actually don't get any commentary from the writer of Exodus who's most likely Moses, at least these sections here, uh, we don't get any kind of indication whether this was regarded as good or wrong, right? It almost goes back to the midwives. Remember the midwives, they're told you need to go and kill the babies. They don't, and they lie, and there's no explanatory sort of commentary that this was good or bad. It's you're left to see it. Although then you see the midwives were blessed, that God blessed them. So you assume that action was correct. And yes, which would you rather be guilty of? Lying or murdering a baby? I think on the scale of things, what I want to be responsible for is I have to answer for my lying.
Wait.
Right?
So you're telling me you're not supposed to just follow the government's decrees no matter what? I thought that. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
I thought you just follow them.
Who would have thought?
I thought you just follow their authority blindly. So when they tell you to
Who
do something, you do it.
who would have thought, right?
Yeah. All right.
This also does highlight that Moses looks around and there's no one around. And so while the murder of the Egyptian, you could say, like, Moses, that was bad. That was the wrong way to do this. What Moses does is he looks around and he sees the oppression. He sees that no one else will do anything, and so that he must act. And so you see that he takes the situation and he personalizes it. He says, no one's going to do anything, and so I must. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is for the progression of the story, for Moses to become the man that he's supposed to be. This is a really important moment because he has to make it true. He has to personalize it himself to say, there's a problem and I have to act.
Oh yeah, and you have to realize too. I mean, this isn't. I mean, he's been living there for 40 years. It's not this first time of him experiencing a Hebrew man being beaten. I'm sure he's probably witnessed it over and over again. It's something that he's probably been bottling up and battling with and going over. And that's why, like you're talking about premeditated, he probably like had those feelings before by seeing his people being enslaved and in bondage. So this was kind of almost like a snapping point. It seems like, at least that's what it looks like.
Yeah. And it does highlight as well that even in that time, even in that situation, even in that moment, he looked and he saw oppression and it was wrong. And I think that might be another thing for us to think back on, to maybe recalibrate, is, there's a lot of people who think, well, if you grow up in a certain situation and you look at things that are happening, you just regard good and evils on a sliding rule.
Subjective.
That it's subjective. It's subjective to the time and the perspective and all those different things. And yet what we see here is that he looks out on something that would have been not really out of the ordinary, and he responds this way. And this is in keeping with the rest of actually how the Old Testament deals with oppressors, and deals with oppressive regimes, oppressive kings and governments, is that God's expectation, he says it, is you leaders are supposed to take care of people. You're supposed to help people. You're supposed to not oppress them. You're supposed to have a civil society. And that's really, you're supposed to punish evildoers, not oppress the innocent. And God goes back to this over and over and over. And so we know that there's this standard that exists, to where even where Moses is in that milieu, he sees it and he wants to correct it. He says, this is wrong. And so he kills the man. He knows it's wrong. That's why he hides the body, right? He buries the body in the sand. The very next verse, he goes out, he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he goes over and he goes, you need to stop. You shouldn't fight with each other. Why are you attacking each other? And the one guy's is like, are you our ruler?
Yeah.
And so what, are you going to kill me like you killed the other guy? And then he knows that either he didn't hide the body well enough, or there were witnesses or something, because now everybody knows that he's the one that killed an Egyptian.
You know what's funny about that too? It just shows human nature, like the idea of gossiping and the how word gets around. I mean, because if you're the Hebrew that was being beaten by the Egyptian, and then Moses comes and kills that Egyptian, you would think you'd actually feel like grateful and like you'd keep it quiet, like, all right, cool, like right on, man, like thanks. The secret's good with me. But clearly, because that's the person that obviously spread the whole fact of Moses killing the Egyptian, was the Hebrew that he saved, or was helping out, because no one else. Obviously, Moses looked around saw that no one was there besides the guy that he was protecting, and then that guy just goes and spews it, and then now everyone knows about it.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
all right, right on, dude, right
The
on.
assumption is the person who was saved went and told people, which of course, yeah, that's, hey, what happened today? Oh, not
Yeah,
much. Some
yeah.
dude killed a dude for me.
Oh yeah,
We need to
Well,
talk.
he knew Moses' name. I mean, if Moses was a high, part of Pharaoh's family, he was known. So this Hebrew man knew. Like, he was like, oh yeah, Moses. I can't believe it. Moses killed this Egyptian. Like, wow. And he started telling everybody that's how it had to happen.
Yeah. And it says he was afraid. Here, I'll put it back here. It said, the men, who made you ruler? You're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian. Moses was afraid, thinking surely what it is become known. And yes, Pharaoh did hear about the event. So it got all the way to Pharaoh. And it
I just
says that he actually sought Moses to kill him.
I just find it so funny how sassy that like, what, you're gonna kill me too? Like, he's just trying to like break up a fight, and you just come at him with that. And Moses is like, what the heck, man? Like, you're my people, Like,
Right.
why are you doing me dirty like that? I'm trying to help him protect you and deliver you, and you guys are giving me. And what's great is the show, like, this sets up his entire time in the wilderness and just
Yeah.
dealing with these stiff-necked just complainers. I think Moses always being complained at. What's going, like, he sets it up here, like, constantly,
Yeah.
his entire time.
And I think it also highlights the fact that Moses felt a connection with his people. His people had felt no connection with him.
None. Yeah.
Was not reciprocal.
Oh, they constantly were giving him, like, oh, I could not imagine how stressed he must have been for his life, trying to lead Israel.
So at least at this point, he feels a connection with them. They still see him as you're just one of the rulers. You're up there and we're down here.
Yeah.
And so there was this disconnect. Pharaoh, and I think then at that point, when Pharaoh tries to seek to kill him, now Moses is like, I'm not even actually a part of that group anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Now I got to run. So Moses is essentially completely alone from his own perspective. And I think this does come down to, yeah, you could ask, could it have been different? I have no idea. But Moses decided to just be the deliverer on his own. Right?
Yeah.
The story could have gone a different direction. Could have had vigilante Moses, right?
Mm-hmm.
You should be like, well, the problem was someone saw me, so I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing, but just so no one sees it. And that I think for us would be like, that's the progression of a hero. Like, oh, he can. What else can he do? What can? I think we like the kind of the idea of the self-made hero, right? And so you go back to comics and movies and stuff, and it's like in the very beginning, it's very, I don't know what other word to use other than grassroots, right? You see a problem, so you go take care of it, and there's always so I think Spider-Man is usually the one that's highlighted of, he goes and he makes his own suit, and it's kind of dumb looking. It's just like pieced together, or whatever. And then they go and he's like a hero, and then somehow learns to sew and makes it better, right? I don't know how that stuff all works, but then he looks like a hero. But the idea is like, so the problem was my method. So like, someone saw me, so I got to be sneakier, and then I'll just be a hero. And I think that's where we like that self-made kind of hero.
Well,
I'm going to be it myself.
It's relatable. It's, yeah, you feel like you could do that. It's like, oh yeah, I could do that. It's.
I think it also sells comics, right? So you can't just be like, oh man, then he actually learned how to really do it, and then finally finished everything, and that's like, what, 3 issues, and you're done. You got to have a continuation. So you have to be the self-made hero and learn through all the bumps and bruises and all the different things, and just do your thing and do that. So I think we like that self-made hero kind of thing. But for Moses, you have to remember, like, this isn't just a story. This is the point of all of this is for a greater justice. The justice isn't just, and then the people weren't being hurt anymore and was paid a fair wage, and now they win. The purpose is completely different. The purpose of this is actual deliverance, right?
Yeah. And it's
so
something.
It's like, oh, good.
I was just saying, and something else you have to look at too with it all is, clearly God is the one that was placing those desires on Moses' heart, the desires of delivering his people. And because clearly God had this plan for Moses from day one, why he was protected in the river and all this stuff. Like I mean, God is sovereign, and he knew what was going to need to be done for Moses to be the deliverer of Israel. So it's just cool seeing, God plant this on his heart, but then knowing where it's going to lead. Moses not obviously making the right decisions all the time, but because God is orchestrating and kind of guiding the whole situation, where you see it come about, because Moses needs all of this type of life experience to become who he becomes in the future, to actually then lead Israel out of Egypt.
Yeah, exactly. And this is that growth arc for
Yeah.
him. I think as far as a deliverance story goes, this is much more like, okay, so imagine if this was the retelling of the Matrix. So from one perspective, what you could have is, oh my gosh, everyone's trapped in the Matrix. You could reprogram the Matrix to just be nice. And then do we win?
Yeah. That's not a very good story.
It's not.
It doesn't sell.
And that's where I think, like, this is where a deliverance story is different than just a regular sort of heroic story. It's like the problem is the oppression. So what if the oppression ceases? Then do we win? And that's not the point. The point's not, let's make it really nice so that everyone just has a better life. That's not the point of the story. That's not the point of a deliverance story. The deliverance story would be an actual change of the order. So if they are the oppressed and they're stuck and they're trapped, then deliverance, an actual deliverance story would be they are no longer oppressed and they're no longer enslaved. It's the big answer, not the small answer, so that you just feel good or that the oppression ceases. Because, little spoiler, when Moses comes back, because Moses is coming back, when Moses comes back, it's not, all right, Pharaoh, fair wage for a fair day's work. It's not better working conditions. It's not, better education for the children living in Goshen. It's not that.
He's not trying to negotiate. Yeah.
No, it's let my people go.
Yeah.
Because Yahweh says, I want my people, my people to go to the desert to worship me.
Yeah.
That's it. They're going to be free. They're not going to be here anymore. And it's the big answer to the question, not the let's fix a problem. And I think that's what makes for a good deliverance story.
Absolutely. And what's cool about the deliverance story is originally Egypt was there to protect and keep Israel safe. And then now, like we were speaking about the last episode, now they have turned into, instead of being a protector, to now being a oppressor.
Yeah, exactly. So what you have is a Moses who's now afraid. And so it says that he fled Pharaoh. Moses fled Pharaoh and he settled in the land of Midian, which is quite a distance. It's hundreds of miles from where he was originally, because he definitely leaves his context and goes to a completely different context. And the land of Midian didn't have great cities, didn't have the culture of Egypt in that same way. So he basically is moving from LA to Bakersfield.
Yeah, basically. Yeah,
or worse, because Bakersfield has an in and out.
Hey, and so you don't get much worse in the flats of Bakersfield. It's pretty hideous, but yeah,
like one of the small towns outside of Bakersfield. That's where he ended up going.
Yeah.
But kidding aside, he goes to a very desolate place, and remember, he's on the run.
You have to remember too the contrast. I mean, he was part of Pharaoh's family. I mean, he was living in luxury. I mean, he was royalty. So he goes from that lifestyle to having all those privileges to now being a nomadic person just by himself. But that's what's so key to his his character development and what God's going to do, because God always does that. He does that to David. He does that obviously to Jesus. Jesus goes out to the wilderness, spend time alone. There's always time that you need to go spend alone with God, and that's what this whole story goes into right here, where Moses goes into this wilderness. He changes, he goes from a life of privilege and all this stuff where he learned Egyptian and Hebrew and was highly educated, to then now he's on his own. He's out there in the fields, he's shepherding, and obviously we'll see where it leads. But he then obviously in chapter 3 comes face to face with God and encounters him.
Yes, and so he goes out to Midian. He's on his own. He's it says that he's settled near a certain well, so he tries to just live a normal life, and he was not a dummy, so he settled by a well. So he settled by water, which is always a great option at that time.
Yep.
And he leaves. And I was trying to think of a good joke, because it says that he became a shepherd eventually. So he was on the lamb and became a shepherd. And I couldn't quite make a joke out of it, but it's something about lambs.
Yeah, it's your desire. It's your desire that matters, man. It's your heart.
Yeah, I tried. So he goes and he settles by this well, which also is, on one side, you'd say it's fortuitous. It is wow, what great fortune. But we know that watching this story, that every part of Moses' life is leading him to a certain place in a certain time. And we'll get to the certain place and certain time next week, but he's being led there. So he's by this well. And I'd say he's doing pretty well. Because he now says that he meets someone here. He says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. So they came to draw water. And some shepherds came, drove them away. If you know anything about shepherds, I think we mentioned this at some other point. We talked about shepherds. But it may have been with David when we're talking about David. But shepherds had a bad reputation at this time. Shepherds lived outside, lived far, away from people. They were seen as like wild men, and oftentimes lived up to the reputation. But these shepherds come in and they basically are harassing these girls. Moses came and he defends them. Again, and not only does he defend them, but then he watered their flocks.
It goes back to him being that's the heart. You see Moses' heart. You see that he wants to protect, he wants to deliver people. So even to these 7 women, he wants to deliver them from these shepherds and protect them.
He does the same thing. Yeah. Doesn't mention he murdered any of them. No. So he's even growing in character. Hey, I won't murder people anymore. That's neat. But he says that he defended them, and then it says that they came home and talked to their father, Ruel, which is interesting because this is his other name. We know him. I think this might be the only time he's called Ruel, but his name is Jethro.
Yeah,
which I think is a better name than Ruel.
It flows a little bit better off the tongue.
It flows better. Yeah, exactly. Why have you come home so early today? So Moses even watered their flocks in an efficient way so that they ended up getting home early. Notice this, verse 19 is important. An Egyptian man rescued us. So he looked or carried himself, maybe it was his accent, but they identified him as an Egyptian. Perhaps it was how he dressed or his hair or something. But they said an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds, and he drew the water for us and watered the flock. He said to his daughter, "So where is he? Why did you leave him?" So they called him to eat a meal with us. I'm sorry. It says call him so you can meal with us. So he's brought in there, sort of like the bachelor living on his own gets brought in, probably, gets a pretty good meal compared to what he was eating. I'm adding that part. I'm thinking like, oh, he's a bachelor on his own. He's probably eating what do bachelors eat nowadays?
No. It depends.
Chili.
Not something you don't have to cook much, something pretty easy and quick.
Right. Something like that. Well, now he gets to have an actual meal. Verse 21, Moses agreed to stay with them. It says stay with the man. So he went to go stay with Ruel, who we know is Jethro.
Yep.
And Jethro gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. I think that there is supposed to be a time break here. I don't think it's, hey, thanks for coming for dinner.
Instantly.
You want
Yeah.
you want to marry my daughter? There's probably a little bit more there to that. This is probably a time jump sort of a thing. And then she bore Moses a son, which, whoa, what a dinner. Right?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Married and
Yeah,
have a kid.
talk about moving pretty quickly, man.
Pretty quick. So this is the time jump, right? They named this son Gershom. For he said, I have become a resident foreigner in a foreign land. And so now Moses is settled in. Now, if this were this might work for like a Hallmark movie, as like a Hallmark movie ending. Like,
This
got
would right here.
married,
Yeah, this would be the ending. You're right.
had a kid, life is good.
Yep.
Roll
He
credits.
got away from Pharaoh and left Bunk, Egypt. Like, all right, I'm out of here.
And honestly, a lot of times we would end the story here. Oh, look.
Yep.
Happily ever after. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely, yeah.
We did it.
Yeah. Instantly have a wife, instantly have a kid.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Wrapped it up in the last 5.
Yeah. So this goes back to kind of almost like that story arc of a hero, right? Where we're talking about now. He's kind of come into this like a bit like oasis now in the wilderness where he's not by himself anymore per se. He's come into this family who now he has a wife, has kids. And I'm assuming Jethro has a role to play in his character development. It's not really explained here as much, but that there's something going on where, I mean, clearly Jethro is grateful for Moses protecting his daughters. He then gives one of his daughters as a wife to Moses. So he's part of the family. There's a relationship being had and growth. And then clearly Jethro being a Midianite or, whatever clan he was in over there that lived in the wilderness, had a lot of knowledge to give to Moses for then when Moses goes into the wilderness later, he will then carry that knowledge that he needs, that God knew that he was going to need to then lead Israel through the wilderness for 40 years.
Yeah, later on, Jethro shows up. He shows up a couple times, but one of those times is where this is decades later, when they are wandering around, and he's like, ugh, I have to he becomes this de facto leader of people where people keep coming to him with their problems, and he's like, I don't have time to help hundreds of thousands of people with their individual issues that they have. And Jethro's like, you need to set up a better system.
Mm-hmm.
You need to divide the people up into certain groups and then have leaders of those groups who talk to other leaders that then go talk to you. So he basically set up sort of a business management kind of structure for disputes. It's like, wow, Jethro is essentially a manager of people and issues. He becomes really important that way.
Would you categorize Jethro as the Gandalf or the Dumbledore type of character here?
He probably serves at least a little bit in that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not highlighted a whole lot. It's just, it would be assumed at this point.
Yeah.
I actually think, spoilers, but next we see Moses. He interacts with Yahweh, and what's interesting is I think actually, as the story goes, it's Yahweh who's the
absolutely
the quote unquote the Gandalf character in the story, but he is his direct mentor and leader and tells him what to do and is disappointed when he doesn't do what he's supposed to do. But you see that there is an actual relationship between Yahweh and Moses that develops through this lifetime here. But yeah, I think in probably the earthly way, Jethro becomes that for him, because when Moses returns, he doesn't act like an Egyptian anymore.
Yeah, that's what I was more thinking, because you're absolutely right. Yahweh is, but when you get to that part, Yahweh says, "I will be with you." It's Yahweh doing it, right? Moses is just a vessel. I was thinking more Jethro being in the humanly realm of a kind of mentor.
Right. God would be, Yahweh is more serves as the mentor, like Dumbledore character. So, Jethro's Hagrid, maybe.
Yeah, there you go. I don't know.
Throw that in.
Yeah.
Something like that. But yeah, that's a great point. He does serve some sort of purpose, because Moses does become part of that household.
Yeah.
So he does serve some kind of purpose there.
That's what I love so much about the Bible too, because there's so much in there, but then there's so much in between these verses and these lines that we don't have, like, we can't know for sure, but we can kind of just put puzzle pieces together and speculate. And I love doing that. Like you're saying, like there's so many, like there's years in between verses. I mean years. So it's cool. I mean, because right here, that entire scripture, there's gonna be 40 years in between this and then when he goes back to Egypt in chapter 3.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's cool being able to kind of just tie things together and put things together where, I mean, it's not like I'm not going to cling to deep doctrine over these like little gap verses, but it's cool to then just try to put things together.
Yeah, totally. And even just to highlight what you just said here, verse 23, during that long period of time. So this time that he was away,
Yeah.
which does amount to about 40 years
Hmm.
of time. During that time, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned because of their slave labor. So it wasn't just that one Pharaoh. This was a continuing thing that happened, right? So the Pharaoh dies, and their oppression continues. And it says that they cried out, and their desperate cry because of their slave labor went up to God. God, hearing their groaning, remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. God saw the Israelites and understood. I think some of the other translations said he heard their cry. So some people go like, did God just forget?
No, that's an idiom.
It is an idiom. It's something that's used in Hebrew as in something was brought to the forefront of your mind.
Yep.
Almost like it's the thing that has your focus now.
Hmm.
And so God hears that, and it is now time to
Yep.
turn all of the focus and the attention on the deliverance of the people.
Yep. Yeah, because he knew that they needed to go through that time to then have this, whole story layout.
So you have this happening. What's interesting is that you see Moses has done this a couple of times already in the story. And so while Moses saw an individual that was hurting and that was in pain, God saw all of the people needed deliverance. And so he remembered, it was brought to the forefront. This is what he's concentrating on. This is now where he is going to be acting, right? And it's also talking in very human terms for God. But that's brought to the forefront. He's remembering this thing. Another way to say that is he's honoring those agreements that he had made with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So he's made promises, and he's going to make good on those promises now.
Yep.
So he saw the Israelites, and he understood, or he heard their cry. He understood what needed to happen, and now he's going to act, is sort of the idea. And then we'll get to it next week, but you get the cool words. Now Moses. Now Moses. You're going to talk to Moses.
Mm-hmm. No,
So
it's
now we'll see that start
Yep.
to come together.
the introduction of Yahweh back into this whole story and everything. It's yep.
Now things begin to work together. So you don't see it. Only looking back on it, you can see this was a big old setup for something that God had. So there's some people say, like, did God not care? Was God not what was God doing there during this time? He was putting together and stitching together this amazing story of deliverance that could only happen in this way, could only happen in this function, and is going to happen for maximum effect. And it's not necessarily the effect that we think it's going to be.
Nope. And to add to that point, it's also something that God has shown in my own life that it's his timeline. God's out of time. He's outside of time, space, and matter, right? So we sit here in this cube, per se, in this reality that we are bound by time, but he's not. So we look at it as, like say you were a Hebrew that was stuck in that bondage and slavery, and you're sitting there questioning God, kind of like, why aren't you here? What's going on? I thought you were the God of gods. Why are we going through this? But that's with a human mindset, thinking on a human timeline. God's outside of it. God knows at a certain time that it's all going to work. It's all going to be good. And it's something I've noticed in my own life where in the moment, now looking back in the past and rethinking how my mind was in a certain situation, kind of thinking like, oh, there's no out. Like I feel like I'm drowning right now. This is unbearable. God, I need your help. I need your deliverance. don't, if you ever get yourself in that situation, realize you are not, you're on God's timeline. God's not on your timeline. And just keep enduring, overcoming, and holding fast to the faith, knowing that God is the deliverer, He is the redeemer, He is going to take you out, whatever, whether spiritually or physically, whatever it may be. But this is a perfect example because they were in Egypt for 400 years, give or take, right? So that's a long time. But to God, that's nothing. To God, He's outside of it. It's just the same moment that they were in Egypt, they're out of it to God. So it kind of helps put things into perspective.
And I think it's true. He does see time that way, but at the same vein, he does go through it with his own people. He sees it. He does understand, and I think that's where we. I think sometimes miss one of the massive aspects of who God is and why He is as great as He is that it says, and it actually says this in one of the Psalms, who is God? Because the Psalm spends the time talking about how great God is and how outside of everything He is. He's not subject to the same frailties that we have. He's outside of these. And he says, who is God then who thinks on us? Right? Because the psalmist, the writer of these songs would say, the cry out to God for such trivial things compared to creation, compared to time, compared to these larger things. He cries out because of the groanings of his own heart. And he says, who is God that He contends with us, that he cares, and yet He does. It's very different. And I think it's important to see because we actually see it in the very next interaction that God has with Moses. He deals with very realistic concerns, very day-to-day kind of things that have to do with how Moses feels about things and how he's going to deal with a thing. And God answers. We are not pawns to God. God contends with us. And that's, I think, it's the amazing way that God is presented in the Bible, and it's the amazing way that I think that we experience that interaction with God even on a daily basis.
Well, it goes back to He's relatable. That's the beautiful part
Right.
about who Jesus is. God coming in the flesh to experience every single attribute and aspect of the human condition, humanity. And He relates. He understands every single emotion, every single thought that you go through, what we go through. And that's the beautiful part about it. He's not this Zeus character that is outside and doesn't have compassion upon his creation. He's not this mythological pagan god that has is like fatalistic, or we're made in His image, so He knows every single thing that we experience and know, and that's why He has compassion on obviously His people that are going through the bondage. He sees them. He feels. He feels more than He understands it all, and that's the beautiful part about our Creator.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that is a great place to land this plane. I'm really excited for next week. I was excited for this week. We got to go through some good stuff here, but I'm excited for next week. Next week, I think, is where we really start to see things really kick off in the story. The setup for what we are looking for and what we're hoping for is for this deliverance story to actually turn around and start to see some action, some feet being put to thought. And I'm excited to go through when we actually get to the deliverance aspects, because we're going to go through some things which I don't think a lot of people have ever thought through or understood. And I think where we're going as far as when we get to the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh, and the confrontation between Yahweh and
the gods.
the gods. And this is going to be a really cool thing. So little teasers for the next few weeks, but I think once we get into it, I think we were saying like, oh, we'll do like 4 or 5 sessions here, but I think it's probably going to extend out a little bit.
Yeah, once we go into the
detail, those aspects. Yeah,
absolutely. There's a lot there. It's like with every plague and everything and what it is, the spiritual realm and the ramifications of what's going on. It's it's pretty
cool.
Oh yeah, if you could make a Hollywood film to actually be biblically accurate and you want to get into the supernatural, it would be amazing. It would be better than Lord of the Rings. It'd be better than everything. Just seeing what's going on. Yeah.
Absolutely. We'll see. We'll see what justice we can do to this story, but until then, let's go ahead and we'll land this plane. Schumann, any final thoughts? Not that you're dying, but just we're ending the stream.
Just enjoy this week, guys. Just keep following the Lord. Just praising Him every day.
That's right. That's right. And my friends, Pilgrim on, we'll see you out there.
God bless.